Hello and welcome to Virtual DDD. We are doing today stories on facilitating software design and architecture. In this episode, the third one of our series, we are with Kenny, Andrew, and myself. We're going to start today with Andrew telling us a story about how they have been facilitating software design and architecture. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Andrea. And thanks for having me, Kenny, as well. And both of you. It's super cool. I didn't manage to join the first one, but it's super cool to join this one. The story that I wanted to share is it's an amalgam of lots of different experiences I've had with facilitating software architecture and design. So if people recognize different bits of this, because I'm a consultant and I work for Saltworks, if people recognize different bits of this, that's because I see this kind of thing over and over again. But the thing I wanted to talk about and kind of maybe get your thoughts on is this time I think almost every single time I've started a software project, I come on board, even if I come on board very early at the beginning, I'm always trying to find like the first or the most fundamental architectural decisions and trying to figure out what those are because they've happened already, right? And maybe they were implicit or maybe they were just like legacy decisions from like the history of why the project got to the point it's got to. And what's interesting to me is the fact that those decisions, which are kind of fundamental or underpinning or very early kind of stage decisions, typically have a very long shadow and they have a very long effect on things. And what's most interesting to me is the fact that they don't. It's not even like everybody knows they're there, and people don't even acknowledge the fact that they exist. One example, I went to one place, and I've been to multiple places, but for the benefits of this story, I went to a client, and they were working on a rewrite and a rebuild of things, and so therefore it was a rewrite and a rebuild. So everyone was kind of treating it as if it was greenfield and if it was completely fresh. Things which kind of touched and informed the fundamentals of what we were doing. And so those kind of things were almost like non-architectural decisions, but decisions which have an architectural impact. So for example, when people were picking like, what's the thing we're going to build or what's the product we're going to build, right? That kind of frames the landscape and within which you're doing, and it kind of dictates where the edges and the boundaries and the scope of your landscape is. And typically when I join, someone's already figured out how many people you'll need in teams and what teams you'll need and all these things kind of, right? And again, like I don't need to convince anyone that has an impact. But what's interesting is trying to figure out what those things have been. And typically when I have come in and like try and figure out architecturally, because we need things to be quite black and white, right? Quite very distinct, right? Kind of in and out, yes and no, all of these kind of things. So from an architectural decision perspective, once or twice I've done this where I've come in and we'll end up having conversations and I'll eventually say, this feels like there's a preceding decision. The time that this worked the best was I started somewhere and there was a bunch of decisions which were kind of historical decisions, which, you know, were not maybe made the most optimal decisions, but they were the decisions that had been taken and that was where everything was and that was where everything was headed. And so after a big long conversation with one of the architects that I was working with, they offered, and so this was their idea, not my idea, they offered to kind of write down those big decisions, like reverse engineer the ADRs, kind of like filling in the history, you know, because like ADRs, I definitely feel anyway, are kind of like an immutable change log of what you're doing in your software. But we were missing the initial one or two or three things. So they wrote down these ADRs around about when we moved these teams and when we decided to pick this technology. And they even recorded like, these are the three different options we selected. And these are the reasons that we thought were bad at the time, but we still did it because these were the circumstances. It was interesting for them to kind of go back and do that kind of archaeological digging back through stuff. But it also gave a lot of clarity to the constraints that were there and why those constraints existed. And then that allowed people to kind of challenge them. If we were like, right, we can't do this because of this. And they were like, well, the reason we didn't do this at the start was because if you look in the ADR, we didn't do it because we didn't have enough people, or we didn't, you know, we like product management didn't think this was as high a priority as this other thing. And then we could say, right now we're looking at this decision again, because you can kind of go back and refactor some of these fundamental decisions, like not, or revisit, not refactor. And with that clarity as to why, because people kind of think that some of these decisions are untouchable, right? You can't go back to them. But if you go back and remind yourself of the context, then you can say, this context has totally changed. Like we were a 12-person startup, right? And now we're a 200-person scale up. So now we do have people to do stuff, right? There was another decision, I think this one's in my book, where the client wanted to move really fast and they were basing everything that they did on AWS. But there was one thing that they wanted, there was a chipset that was only available on Azure. So therefore they took this decision to do something, knowing that their strategically target platform was AWS, but that they didn't have this chipset that they wanted available. Then they could go and say, right, for this small decision, we're going to take this thing and go to GCP, and it'll be like a bounded decision. So it kind of freed them up and it reminded them what the actual constraints of their previous decisions were, as opposed to these kind of not very clear implicit decisions, setting artificial kind of boundaries on things. And that was super important. The reason we did it at that time was because the client I was working for was a scale-up. So they needed all of this clarity to make it clear to all of the new people joining why we're doing this, why we're doing that. But I think having done loads of things since then, I think it's a kind of approach which can work really well, like these fundamental decisions. Like if you're working on a multi-tenant system, what do we mean by a tenant? What's the boundaries of our systems, et cetera, et cetera? What's our core domain? What are the things we build? What are the pieces we don't build, et cetera, et cetera? And so loads of those things are typically implicit, but you can pull them out and make them explicit, even if they're kind of underpinning. So that's my experience. And I was wondering, like, I guess maybe you've seen this kind of thing before as well, or?
Well, it really reminds me of some workshop I did in the past called Appreciative Inquiry, which had nothing to do with architectural decisions, but everything to do with like events or decisions. And it really reminded me about that. And now I'm thinking about, it would be really well to do an event storming, what decisions have we done so far? And what are decisions that we still make? You can 100% sort of like event storm that. What are the events that decision took place, even though they're not right? So that's my first thought. And then with Appreciative Inquiry, what we did then was looking at what are some good and bad decisions. And there's a difference, right? What are some good and badly made decisions? And what were some good decisions that had bad outcomes? Because
100%.
right, the resulting there's a difference between the two. But I think you can definitely like storm that out in a whole group. That was my first thought. And then you can take, which decision do we want to take with us? Which decision do we need to change? And then you can do sort of like a reset, maybe what you're saying, then write some of these stuff down as okay, we took this decision, this is what we know, and then just move on.
Yeah, like a baseline or like snapshot in like an event-driven system, right? You're like, we could go all the way back, but then the further we go back, we're into like people remembering, and like half of those people, maybe all of those people left, right? Like I see things before where like nobody can quite remember what the decision was or why it was taken. It's just, we use this software to do this. And you're like, why? No one can even remember why this happens anymore.
Yeah.
That was kind of my question as you were talking about this. Is there a particular trigger that made you want to, and like, is it more about like, Andrew, found it a good practice to, when I start the place, try to make this explicit to make your life less, in making change easier, basically? Or is there particular signals that you are looking for to implement this strategy?
It's a good question. So I think now, because lots of my practice has kind of come about from, like we were talking about this a bit before we started recording, Andrea, right? Like I don't think there's a level of this in my book. I had not a fight with O'Reilly, but I was trying to make, when I wrote my book, I was like, I don't want this to be like a recipe. Do these things and then you will get success, because you kind of don't. It's more like, watch out for these things and then you'll probably be able to figure out what to do. So it came about because it was a specific client and we were there specifically to help them scale up. So they'd made loads of decisions super fast and they'd figured out what their problem solution fit was and their product market fit was, right? They'd figured that out, but they'd run really fast. So the people who were there remembered, although the different people remembered different aspects. So like the reason we picked Amazon over GCP is this. And if you spoke to someone else in the data team, they'll be like, we hate those guys. We lost the battle. Whereas like the people who wanted AWS don't think anyone lost. They're just like, we picked the best thing. So that was kind of like, to just for that purpose, it was like, we keep having to explain the same thing over and over again to every new person who joins. We just want to explain, and we want to say, we know it's not perfect, and we know everyone wasn't happy, and we know we maybe regret it because at the time it was good, but now it isn't good.
There, because that's something interesting. We need to re-explain everything. And
Yeah.
there's a telephone game in there.
Oh, totally.
So the early decision, and this is what I see many times as well, right? Some person made decision, never wrote it down. And then when you come in, you talk to one person, they say A, and you talk to one person B, and there's already a conflict, right? And then when you ask is, okay, who made the decision? When is it made? Nobody would say, well, it's over there. I made that decision and this is the reason. And it's never one coherent story when you don't write them down.
Yeah, totally.
And that reminds me of there's a total telephone game going on there, and then ranking. And
yeah, because this is, and that goes to 2 points that I think we don't worry about enough, but make a big difference. Because when we build software, I don't think I've ever seen the software being maintained by a team with the same team that built it, right? We move around a lot, right? We do a bunch of stuff. We arrive somewhere. I mean, I know I'm a consultant, right? So I do this. This is my job. But even then, there's very infrequently someone who's been there forever. And then there's the danger of, like Alberto Brandolini would call them becoming the dungeon master and all this kind of stuff, right? But most people move around. Like, very few people are living in the code bases that they created. They're living in the code bases that someone else created, and they're trying to. And if they don't know the reasons why, because like you said, you don't get decisions are good and bad, and that's architecture. What Dano and Taylor would say, right? Architecture is like you do the trade-offs and all that kind of stuff. There is no best decision, there's no right decision. It's the best one given the circumstances and what you know, etc., etc. And then you hope that decision gets into code, which maybe does or maybe doesn't happen. Like, this is like the thing, like the explaining, like you're saying, Kenny, right? Like people they go like, you told me this thing when I joined, or I read these pages on the wiki, and then I looked at the code base and I'm having difficulty understanding. At least if you have some ADRs, at least for significant things, you can explain like the historical forces that were affecting this kind of thing, which helps people like raise the empathy for the code base and each other and all of the other different things, and understanding they can reverse engineer the mental landscape of what was going on as to why things are like they are. And then they know what they can maybe try and fix, or maybe try and change, or maybe try and evolve. And I think, because I've talked about this elsewhere, I think at Newcrafts, like this, like different bits of code bases can have like strong ego power, right? Like it can feel like you shouldn't touch it because someone who's probably now a senior executive like wrote these parts of the code, and we all know we can't touch it. And you're like, but why? Like, they don't live there anymore. It's like they built this thing and then they've left it, gone and done something else.
Some people, some places that that I know of, I've been there, and I'm sure you've probably been there too, of places that they left and there's theoretically in some other position, but in reality, if you touch their baby, they will, these people will cry and will come down and be like, oh, you touched my baby? What is the story with this?
Yeah, very interesting. And I think, like, I've seen this too, right? Like, if you write that down, because people forget, like, they're like, oh, I did the best thing and I built the best thing. But I don't think when you speak to most people when they're doing things, they're like, no, there were a bunch of forces and these are the things that we were taking account of at the time.
Actually, this is the thing. So I'm going to answer this last. But how do you write down about the power imbalances in ADRs in a useful way?
Yeah, I don't think I do. I think this is something I want to think about more. I'm thinking about it more and more. It's definitely not in the book. I mean, I think it should be in the book. So yeah, but it's not. I think it's important.
A good question. I face this myself, and I'm very curious about other people's thoughts. We maybe can do a whole episode about this. Like, there are some personal reasons that are very, let's be honest, we're in a patriarchal or in a male dominant industry where if you're dealing with emotions, it's very hard to talk about most of the time. I find it very hard. Well, I find it easier now, but I've been to a lot of therapies to talk about that. But I've had situation where, there's a clash and there's a lot been said about an architectural decision. Writing that down felt very hard for them to like write down. So going into the conflict management, should we write down the conflicts and the power play that was there? Because that's relevant context, but it's also very hard to write that down. How do people interpret that? And B, it's very fragile.
It's extremely context aware. So my question really was about that. The things like it's important because if there was a conflict, and even the thing that you were explaining earlier, Andrew, that thing of, oh, we chose AWS and the data people are like, oh, we actually preferred GCP or something else. And it's like, oh, those people that did, even that should be in the ADR. But
100%.
it probably isn't. This is why it's so important, because when you revisit this decision, people that have a memory won't be like, oh, we're going to get them back the staff. Or maybe not. Or maybe they'll be like, you know what, actually, we live with AWS and it's all right. And we always just wondered. And so my general take is to say there was a conflict. And not, and it's like, it might be worth talking to people in data and blah. These were the 2 points. But it's not always possible to write that down safely. And that's where Kenny's comment come about the safety of
But we should
who's writing what.
Yeah, we should definitely dive deeper. But I think you just portrayed a heuristic, right? What if something, right, on a personal conflict, like we call it personal conflict, task-based and relationship-based. So what if there's a relationship-based conflict? Do we write that down? But I think it's a good heuristic to just write down there was a personal conflict. Just talk with these people.
Yep.
I think that would be a good heuristic already to help people. Like, what if you deal with that? Do this for now, and maybe in the next episode you could definitely dive deep.
There's one thing actually I forgot about this. In my book says there's someone on my current client who's using this, and it's really good because there's where I am at the moment, there's a lot of teams with a lot of people trying to move really fast. Not everyone agrees with every single decision. And so, but there's a thing I've suggested, and I've seen it occasionally in ADRs, where when you've got the pros and cons of each option, you can say adopted despite, right? So we take this, even though we know that this is a downside, right? So we've taken this option, even though this is a downside, or rejected despite. And I've seen that work well, where people, they at least feel acknowledged, and they feel acknowledged not in the comment section, they feel acknowledged in the body of the thing. So you can say, right, I disagree with you, but I'm still going to acknowledge that kind of stuff. And like you say, Kenny, it doesn't need to be like these people fell out with each other, but this was a disagreement and stuff. There's bits in my book about coalescent argumentation. So it's like trying to figure out where the area of disagreement is, because when there's disagreements, frequently it's like, right, I don't like Andrea, so therefore any idea that Andrea comes up with is terrible, which, let's be honest, is not going to be true. But maybe there was a thing where we're like, right, this bit we disagree. And then when you zoom in on it, so writing about ADRs can be good. And again, my big thing, small ADRs, right? Because if it's a big ADR, then there's the chances of a clash is far bigger. If you break that up into smaller pieces, you're like, and this comes from Reinert's, and it's like principles of product development flow. Within every big decision, there's one or two bad ones. So if you break a big decision into 20 small decisions, then like 18 of them will be good, and then 2 of them might be bad or hard, right? But at least you can then focus, and then you can have a discussion and a disagreement about something specific, as opposed to, I will block your whole thing because I don't like the fact that you're going to use Node for this tiny little some library I don't like.
I think next session we could definitely invite Heen talking about decision making, because decision making theory, there's also a lot about what we want. So I think that's an interesting, how would we write that down, what we want? So that's a personal interest.
Yeah,
I think we're on time-ish.
Yeah.
So maybe we should do some closing comments. Maybe a little summary wouldn't be amiss. So it feels like Andrew told us a story about surfacing implicit and very important decisions that happen. That's a good way to kick off things. Then we talked about how we could maybe include conflict or not in ADRs. Anything else? I mean, there's more than that, obviously.
Yeah, I think another heuristic here would be write down past decisions that cause conflict, right? If there's a lot of confusion, just start writing them down and reset them in a way.
Yeah. Because decisions are made at a point in time, right? It's what you knew and thought and felt at the time.
So is that goodbye for now?
Yeah.
For this episode. Well, thank you very much. And see you next time, people listening to Facilitating Software Architecture and Design.